everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning for the Provider Alliance Financial Management Committee meeting. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We are going to use the chat and the Q&A if you guys want to use that. We're also, because we'll have a small enough group, we can certainly open up mics for people if you have questions or comments during the course of the session today. So just raise your hand using the Zoom feature and we'll unmute you. Again, my name is Craig Douglas. I'm here supporting the team today, and welcome to our financial management meeting. We are recording the session today, so if anybody has any issues you need to jump off or you need to step away for a moment, you can email information@provideralliance.org and we'll make sure that we get you a link for the meeting recording for today. And with that, I'll turn it over to our chair, Tom Kravchuk.
Thanks so much, Craig, and good morning, everyone. We have about 168 registrants for this meeting, which is pretty impressive considering it's a Friday morning in the summer. So thank you all for your dedication and attention today. We encourage everyone at the end to really raise your voices and add to the discussion, and please pose your questions either by opening up your microphone at the end or using the chat function. In terms of how this meeting is going to flow this morning, we've got a group of really great panelists today, starting with Bill Harriger from Barber National Institute, Chris Saylor from Keystone Human Services, Lindsay Bogan from the Mercer ARC, and Oren Kern from Life Steps, and as well as myself. I am the Vice President and CFO of Melmark. So in terms of the agenda for this morning, on the next slide, we're going to cover a budget update, fee schedule rates, the Mercer actuary report, and then move it over to discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick to cover the first two agenda items.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tom. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks for all of you for being here today. So to kind of level set where we are today, a lot has happened over the course of the month of July, of course. So a lot of these numbers are big numbers, but they are what has been enacted in the budget. Previous to that, what was proposed. And that difference is kind of what has an impact for us on our system and why fee schedule rates, as well as financial incentives related to performance-based contracting, are in fact changing. So just to start high level, again, this is a Pennsylvania budget. So all the dollars that are always discussed are state dollars. There are federal matching dollars. You know, we sometimes go back and forth. The rates obviously get funded by both. But when it comes down to the actual appropriation, what the governor proposes, what the General Assembly ultimately has to approve, that becomes the enacted budget signed by the governor, those are always referred to in state dollars. So if you look at what the governor proposed back on February 6th, it was $2.645 billion state dollars for the intellectual disabilities waiver program line item. So that's the line item in the budget that really supports all of the community services in intellectual disabilities. So throughout the course of the spring into the summer, the governor's office and DHS and the provider community all aligned around advocacy to support the governor's investment. So for the first time in a while, we had an investment that we did support. We weren't asking for additional funds. We weren't shut out of the budget. So procedurally, it was a very easy process to get behind that, as did the governor himself. Unfortunately, as we learned on July the 11th, we did not get everything that had been anticipated. And right up until the evening of July 10th, we had some information intelligence that the budget would be approved the next day and that it would in fact include what the governor had proposed in the February budget. So I guess I would say beginning with July 11th, that really sort of put things into a tailspin in terms of implications. So the $93 million in state funds, again, this is not anything that people can really relate to at the organizational level, but it's a big number, of course. And when you factor in federal matching, there's a lot of things we don't have full transparency on. What does the state encumber to do annualization of programs and startups and people who enter the system? So there's a lot of things we can't really pin down. But at the end of the day, the $93 million was cut. We wondered immediately what were the implications of that. So along with our colleagues at the other IDA associations, we had been meeting regularly anyway. And starting on July 12th, we really began meeting daily. I think we had even met on the 11th. Once word started to leak out, we could see the tracking report and we could see this $93 million difference. We started meeting that day. So I just want to let everyone know that the advocacy continued probably most strongly over that 11-day period or so, from the 11th to the 22nd, when we ultimately learned that there would indeed be changes to the fee schedule rates. When we first saw the $93 million cut, we did not know the implications of that with respect to the fee schedule rates. Of course, those had been published going back to the online version of the PA Bulletin, April 19th of this year. So when we were all at the Dan Miller Disability Summit and we did a meeting from that summit, those rates had just come out. Chris Elliott from Barber had a tool. We did a similar session to this. Everybody was able to really calculate what the impact of those rates would be if the budget was enacted. However, there was always the caveat that the budget had to be approved, which is why we continued our advocacy right through the day the budget was passed in the General Assembly. So throughout the course of that 11-day period, we advocated very strongly. The associations got together daily, as I said. We came up with a fact sheet. We approached people in the administration, people in ODP. We really just pressed the issue about the rates and the impact. And we also put forth the argument that we believe there was sufficient funding in this $2.552 billion to continue to move forward with the fee schedule rates as published. As a fallback position, because during that period, we start to learn that there is an intent to recalculate the rates. As much as we staked out the ground that we think there's funding sufficient to fund these rates, we did offer an alternative that if you do it a little bit later in the year, you could still spend the allocation in this year's budget, but we would get the rates. Concern, of course, being that rates, generally speaking, there's no requirement to change them except for once every 3 years, or even to just analyze the data that goes into making the rates once every 3 years. So finally, on July 22nd, we learned that indeed VHS, ODP, in alignment with what had been enacted in the governor's budget, clearly in cooperation with the General Assembly, that there would be rate decreases, that there was no opportunity to carry forward these rate increases in this state fiscal year to a subsequent year where that would cost more money. There was a hard number that they had to align with. So we got very clear answers at that point. Again, about 11 days out. In fact, the morning we got that information, this was jointly with all the IDA associations, with Secretary Arkush, with Kristen Ahrens, where we got those details. Just an hour prior, we had a meeting with the administration continuing to make our arguments that I just stated in terms of retaining those fee schedule rates. So I did want to review a little bit of the budget, also the implications of the budget. So what did we learn on July 22nd? I know we have put it out, as have all the associations. So as you come into this meeting today, the understanding remains that there will be an across-the-board rate increase of 6% for residential services, 8% non-residential services, and that performance-based contracting financial incentives would be decreased also from 5% and 8% to select residential and clinically enhanced down to 3% and 5%. Now, commensurately, because of the comment period, there have also been performance standards and some things that have been reduced in terms of meeting those standards, which would be fair and appropriate in terms of the amount of investment and return on investment that providers by now have calculated. But of course, we don't really know, and only you can determine how far you are from target and what that investment is. So we encourage everybody to look at that now with this new information. Also announced for modifications to pay for performance. I won't get into those really in any detail. That was never really completely formulated by ODP, so it's hard to really calculate the impact of pay for performance. We have continued to press ODP on the fact we would like to make sure that anything that is not spent in claims can be redirected to providers through pay for performance, and we're not clear to what extent they can do that. I think we'll have to let them build the framework out first before we can determine that. So before I toss this back to Tom and the panel, I did want to say that in alignment with today's discussion, the Mercer report, some of the assumptions you may be familiar with by now, some of the recommendations we have previously made to the state from TPA on rates, rate assumptions, other assets and resources. One of the things we would like to be able to do is coordinate partnerships and strategic alliances that would be directed at some form of savings. So one piece of information we'd like to have, given the size of the audience we expected today, we'd like to launch a poll about the health insurance carriers that you are using in your benefit plans. So if you're able to answer this, you should be able to provide multiple responses if you do offer a couple of different plans. So based on this information, this will enable us to have some conversations with some of the purveyors of these plans, maybe directly, maybe through brokerage houses or other means. But if you're able to provide us with this information, I think it would be very helpful going forward, and perhaps something we can review again at a later date at a subsequent meeting. So with that, thank you again, Tom. I will throw it back to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, so you could see on the next slide that TPA has been very successful in obtaining the Mercer actuary report through a right to know request. And I think we should all be deeply appreciative to Patrick and the TPA team for taking the time to do this. It's a very long report. Some of you may not have read it, but I encourage you to really dig into it, despite the fact that you might be going through hundreds of pages of performance-based contracting information. There's a lot in this Mercer report that will help you determine whether or not your organization will be appealing the rates when they come out as final on August 31st. And I wanted to walk you through some of the highlights of it. And I've already come to the conclusion that most of us should be consulting with our attorneys and appealing these rates based on the findings of this report. So moving on to the next page, again, it's probably 180 plus pages, so we can't go through everything today, but I did want to talk through a few things. So if you see in step 2, ODP and Mercer convened a work group, what they consider to be the Medicaid rate setting work group, which was effectively comprised of ODP staff. This is in stark contrast to how they did it the last time that there was a rate update, in which case there was pretty broad and diverse stakeholder input. I know Chris Saylor, Bill Harriger, myself, and a number of other people across the state sat on the panel. Although most of the suggestions and recommendations that we had relative to what the actual cost and assumptions should be did not make it into the final rates, at least they asked for stakeholder input. And in this case, it is clear that ODP and Mercer made the decisions. And from looking at emails from a few years ago between Mercer and ODP from a right to know request, it was pretty clear that Mercer follows whatever ODP's direction is. And it also is consistent in the engagement letter that ODP has with Mercer that they are ultimately responsible for all the end results. So just something to keep in mind relative to how these rates were developed. I also found it notable toward the bottom, highlighted in yellow, that Mercer trends it, the Bureau of Labor Statistics compensation data to the midpoint of the implementation period. So they basically took what the rates were and they rolled it forward to January 1st, 2025. I found it notable because that would suggest that these rates were only intended to be used for 1 year. And potentially they were considering to do another update at the beginning of the next fiscal year. Whereas I believe when the rates were established in the past, they intended to use them for 3 straight years. So just something else to note there. On the next page, you'll see the most egregious assumption, in my opinion, relates to the application of overtime work for employees who work more than 40 hours in a week, particularly the misapplication of the Fair Labor Standards Act relative to classifying DSPs as if they are exempt employees simply because they make more than $35,568. That is wholly wrong for 2 reasons. One is the Fair Labor Standards Act has actually been amended, and that threshold has increased to $43,888 effective June 30th, and is expected to increase to $58,656 in January 2025. So those assumptions are no longer valid because this ruling came out a few days after ODP released the rate setting assumptions in April. And even if these thresholds were correct, it is still not appropriate based on any expert that I've talked to, or my own interpretation of it, for a DSP to be classified based on their job description as salaried exempt based on their duties tests. Because for those of you familiar with the Fair Labor Standard Act, it is not simply the threshold, and anyone over that limit can work more than 40 hours in a week and you don't have to pay them more. It also has to consider their duties test and the duties of a DSP in the HCBS program tends not to meet that test. Furthermore, we've looked at the job descriptions of the state center employees, and those job descriptions indicate that those employees are non-exempt, and the job postings clearly indicate that overtime is paid at time and a half. So the fact that overtime is listed as not applicable for residential services is a major flaw, which unduly reduces the actuarially sound rate ranges that are found throughout this report and that were proposed. It's also just incorrect and something that ODP needs to fix. On the flip side, you'll see for CPS, I excerpted that here. They assume that there is a 5% overtime. And Patrick has included in the chat some links to the Mercer report that we're discussing. On the next page, you'll see what I think is probably the most important section, because a lot of the rest of the Mercer report includes data that is already publicly available in the rate setting assumptions logs that were publicly published. But what's not publicly published would be the actuarially sound rate ranges for each rate. So if you think about a lot of the assumptions where they say, maybe a DSP makes anywhere between $15.56 and $24 an hour, those rate ranges, as well as the amount of vacation they get and a number of other variables, create effectively a lower bound and an upper bound rate. So an employee DSP making $24 an hour on average, if they set all those assumptions there, then presumably the rate would be set at the upper bound. And if it was at the lower bound, then it would be closer to that $15.56 per hour in the high school equivalent DSP and residential example. So you'll see that in order for ODP to establish the April rates, they looked at a few variables. First was what the rate was in the past from 22 through 24. Then they considered where they could set the rates, knowing that based on these assumptions, which were required by the 6100s to be market-based, they cannot set the rate lower than the lower bound as seen here. And they can go as high as the upper bound, and it's still actuarially sound based on the data that Mercer did. Effectively, ODP knows that utilization is a variable, but they have a pretty strong sense of who they like to come off the waiting list, what historic utilization has been, and those trends. So they assume what utilization is, and then they effectively slide the scale somewhere between the lower bound and the upper bound, match that with utilization, and then hope that the end result, which is listed as fiscal impact, fits within the state budget appropriation. And if all that works out, then they set rates, and that's what's used. The issue comes when the fiscal appropriation is less than what they had assumed, in which case they need to slide the rates lower and hope that it still fits within the actuarially sound rates. So this is just some non-residential services, which they projected was going to cost an additional $158 million. On the next slide, you'll see the same exhibit for residential services, where they were projecting that needs group 1 and 2 was going to increase by about 8%, needs group 3 just over 8%, needs group 4 about 11.7%, and needs group 5 5%. So if you go to the next slide, you can see a summary of what the total cost of the April projected rate update was going to be. You'll see selected rates total $433 million. And all the way to the far right-hand column, you will see selected rates, a total increase of 11.7%. So this is really consistent with what the governor has been saying from April through June, that providers were going to get a 12% increase. The 11.7, rounds up to 12. That's what was publicly said, and this is where all the information came from. As soon as July 11th happened, and we started to hear that we were going to get less money than initially expected, the first thing I did was went to this page of the Mercer report and started to try and theorize what could happen to us, right? Can't sleep at night without figuring out what's going to happen to us, as if we could prognosticate. So interestingly enough, if you looked at the middle line, residential services, they were projecting a 9.8% increase based on the April rates. And we know that for the residential eligible services, in order for the rates to be actuarially sound, based on the assumptions that Mercer and ODP published in April, they cannot have a rate increase less than 7.7% on average. As you know, they've announced that it's going to be 6%, which means it no longer fits within that actuarial range. Similarly, for non-residential services, we're expecting a 16.5% well-needed increase. But based on what ODP's own actuary Mercer said, you cannot increase these rates by less than 12.1%. And if you do, it's no longer actuarially sound. So they are in quite a predicament, and it is very favorable that TPA got us this right to know request report, because we can use this information in our appeals to show that based on the market update as required by the 6100s, that the rates that are published in August 31st, do not meet those market updates. I suspect, although I do not know, that ODP will end up changing some of the assumptions, as they did a few years ago, to lower the rates, and we'll be able to see what assumptions were changed. So again, the fact that this all came out in April is very favorable for all providers who wish to appeal this. So what does this mean per service line? If you go on to the next slide, I took all of Appendix A and I exported it into Excel, and then I selected some services that I know TPA members provide. Again, it's the comparison of last year's rate, what they proposed in April, and what that increase would be for a variety of services. And when I was anxious and not knowing what would happen with the rates when they approved less funding, I wanted to see what type of flexibility each rate would have before it would pierce that floor, knowing that ODP wouldn't want to go under that floor, since that floor was publicly available and would be subject to appeal. So you could see Companion had very little wiggle room before piercing the floor. In-home community supports, the April rate that was proposed was actually proposed at the floor, meaning every single rate setting for in-home community supports is at the lowest end of the published ranges, and they cannot drop that rate by 1 penny. And if they do, they need to change assumptions. So that will be very ripe to appeal. Shift nursing, I included this one just because this is rare, in that that rate could decrease by 7.7% before it drops below the floor. So when they took that rate from the proposed 12% down to the 8%, it is still actuarially sound, which means perhaps it's less favorable upon appeal, but I would still encourage you to appeal it, and so on and so forth for non-residential. Residential, you see, again, I selected needs group 3 and 4 since there's a lot of utilization in those buckets. 8%, 11% increases were projected. We know that they could only decrease them by 1.2 to 1.7 to 0.8% before piercing the floor. And now we're hearing that in August, those rates are only going to increase by 6%, which means they have pierced the floor. So what is the impact on that? If you go to the next slide, you will see that in-home community supports, for example, after it is only increased by 8%, it will be below the floor by about $35 million. So they will need to change actuarial rate setting assumptions to the tune that they can fund it $35 million less than they had initially proposed in April. Taking companion funding about $17 million below the floor. That's not to say that it is $17 million less than what was proposed in April, because in April it was above the floor. But this is just a comparison of how deep we're going below the floor. Finally, I'll note needs group 4 without day, they're decreasing that rate by about $90 from where they had projected it would be in the draft April report. And if you recall, there was very little wiggle room, I think 0.8%, that they could decrease that before it would go below what the actuaries said was a fair rate. And the impact of that is $40 million below what the actuaries said you could do based on the update that they did as required by the 6100. So in the next slide, you will see just a comparison again. As these slide decks go out later, you can digest it. It's just a side by side of the last two slides of where we were expecting to be in April relative to what the actuary said, how low can you go, and where we're expected to go in August. So what does all this mean? On the next slide, you will see in aggregate that 118 procedure codes are expected to fall below what Mercer, the actuary, said was the lowest rate range that they could use. And in aggregate, the fiscal impact is about $121 million lower than the actuarially sound floor. So that's a big deal. The actuary said this is as low as you can go, and they went $121 million lower than that. Now, the actual fiscal impact of the decision to move to 6% for non-residential and 8% for residential, based on the data that I could discern from the actuary report, is about $186 million. So 186 million less funding will come out, and that's relatively consistent with the 93 million that Patrick showed us a few slides earlier. And the difference is that the 93 million decrease is just state funds only. I will caveat that I don't have all the data. I was deriving utilization from the Mercer report based on their expected Mercer fiscal impact and what we knew the proposed rate increase was going to be. In some instances, like needs group 5, because they're collapsing all the needs exceptions into there, they just assume a 0% fiscal impact. So we don't actually know what the utilization is in that bucket. So there is some noise there, but fair to say the fiscal impact would be at least $186 million, and that these rates are no longer actuarially sound to the tune of at least $121 million. So I do hope that you use this information when determining whether or not you are going to appeal the rates at the end of August. And I strongly encourage you to talk to your attorney about doing so. So without further ado, that's all that we have prepared on the Mercer report. I now wanted to pass it over to the panelists to give us their thoughts on the crazy activities that have happened over the last month. Bill, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and I'm glad we're taping this, Tom, because I think that's just is a master's class in what just happened. With the whole rate setting and the Mercer report. Thank you so much for your hard work and pulling this all together. We greatly appreciate it. Just for clarification's sake, the lower bound in the rates that they looked at, when it comes to salaries, they use the 25th percentile of the SOX that make up, say, the DSP. And that becomes the anchor point at the lower end, which is actuarially sound, anything above that. And on the higher end, this is in the Mercer report, they use 75 percentile of the various SOX that are used. So to Tom's point, if they go below that, then they are breaking the floor of what is actuarially sound and should be a case where we can appeal. What compounds the problem, and again, that's a perfect slide there to use. If residential was, the floor was an increase of 7.7, it's gone up by 6. I mean, something has to give and something has to be below the lower bound in order to drive that number down to 6%. If you can just toggle back a couple more slides, maybe. There was one that maybe keep on going. In any event, the overtime, there you go. The overtime assumption, I just wanted to explain to them because we did some pretty good work on this last time. And that overtime assumption, the way it calculates mathematically is if, say, collectively, all of us across the state are enjoying 20% of our hours paid and worked at an overtime rate, we need that overtime assumption to be 10%. So the overtime assumption that we need them to use is half of the overtime that we're actually incurring. And the reason that is that they apply that factor to 100% of the hours that we pay. So if the surveys that we do come back and say that we are paying 15% of our worked hours at an overtime rate, we need this assumption to be 7.5% in order for us to break even with our actual overtime costs. And all that does is increase the lower bound, right? So that $15.56 there, if that number is 10%, that's going to go up by $1.50 because of overtime assumption. And that's going to blow that other slide where the lower bound was, stated at 7.7. That's just going to increase that exponentially. So the damage is really perhaps worse than the 120 million that they've pulled out of the budget. So, and just as long as we're on the damage of the rate increase or the lack thereof, I mean, everybody's happy that the rates have gone up. But just as a point of reference, from January 1st of 2018 to today, on the Bureau of Labor Statistics CPI calculator, the rate of increase is 26.75% since 1/1/18 to today. And with these numbers going to 6% for residential, for example, our increase since 1/1/18 will be about 17%. So we're still about 10% below CPI. Going back to 1/1/18. So I think there's a lot of points that we could argue, and maybe ODP wants us to argue these points so we can get back to at least the actuarially sound lower bound. So to Tom's point, I would encourage most of us to begin seriously considering appealing after the rates do become final on 8/31. Thank you.
And next, Oren.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to try to reiterate again what Tom has said and what Bill just finished saying. I don't know how many people were involved and completed the 2023 NCI survey that was due. Don't quote me on the date. I think it was like near end of June. They did extend that a couple times, but my point of this is in that survey, they asked providers to list overtime. It was looking at home and community services, residential, CPS, things of this nature. I haven't ever seen a survey or a report submitted to the department that does not include overtime for services, including residential. Just as some information, for Life Steps, our overtime hours were like over 100,000. I mean, for them to have an assumption that in residential setting there is no overtime hours is so, I can't even think of a right adjective to use. It's mind blowing that they would even propose that. So again, really consider taking when the rates become public, the rate assumptions will become public. You can review those. Last time we were on a call of this similar nature, we talked about things that were in the ineligible rates, like assumptions for food and utility costs. There are some some really big holes in their rate assumptions, and that is on top of the lower bound issues that are being presented this morning. Thank you.
And next, Lindsay.
I am so thankful for all the work that Patrick has done and the other agencies for the advocacy to get the rate increase. But as Bill has said, it's been years since we've had a rate increase. So my biggest concern is that in 3 years, we'll have another rate review, but no guarantees that there's going to be another rate increase. And like Bill had said, we're at how much inflation. So the costs continue to increase, but the rates don't seem to represent those increases. We at Macara union shop, so we've got a union contract where I've got a guaranteed wage increase for my DSPs, which deservedly so, but it's not coinciding to the rate or the wage bounds that they have. So I hope we continue to advocate for annual rate increases. I mean, I know it's been ongoing for years, but I think that's something we really have to continue to push with ODP.
Thanks, Lindsay. And Chris?
Yeah, just to wrap it up, back to Tom and Bill, when we were on the rate setting committee for the last time, and we had expressed concerns with several of the assumptions, and they barely, I shouldn't say barely, they changed a few. But the fact that, you know, it may not have to be the same group, but they didn't actually have us come in and give any stakeholder input on the rates. But in addition to the overtime, which I was worried about with the lower bound and the assumptions, some of the things that we had brought up previously still remain the same, such as onboarding training days per staff member, 1 day. To get 1 day to train a staff to be in a residential setting, provide support employment, whatnot. So that still remains the same, even though we expressed our concern about last time. We also expressed concern with health insurance and the amount that they were giving us for that particular category. Overtime, we already talked about, so that's a no-brainer. And then we also talked about trying to get them to parse out administrative costs and what they were lumping in that particular line item, which was 10%. So just giving rise to some of those things that we had tried to lobby for before.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks for reminding me about the training days assumption. If you go to page 4 of the Mercer report, you will see that Mercer indicates that ODP has decided to use 3 new hire training days for all services, whereas when that's either a typo or perhaps they misapplied it in the residential rate setting because they used 1 training day there. So again, these are all elements that you should discuss with your attorneys when doing your appeal, because I feel like these errors, would help make our case in the appeal. That said, ultimately, I expect ODP to come up with a new assumptions log with different rate ranges that magically all the new rates that are only 6 or 8% fit into. But again, the differences between this Mercer actuary report and the one that I anticipate would be derived and available in August when the rates go final would be a great roadmap to start when appealing. And Craig, if you could go forward a few slides, it was the last one before question and answer. I realize I went through this relatively quickly. I mean, what I highlighted in orange here would be what I consider to be the 5 biggest losers. So supports coordination, they are saying funding is going to be $7.3 million lower than what the actuary said it should be based on the rate assumptions that they did in the update. Companion, $17 million under that actuarially sound floor. In-home community support's another big loser, $42 million under the floor because those rates were actually set at the floor. The rates published in April. And then residential services, $51.5 million under the floor. I would say that's the second biggest loser. And ultimately, the biggest loser in all of this is the vulnerable individuals and their families who sit on the waiting list, who potentially could have been taken off the waiting list and started receiving supports had they decided not to cut $186 million of funding. I get that it is politics and it happened at the last minute with leadership Senate, but it doesn't have to be this way. And we need to continue to appeal and advocate. I've got adult residential services in Massachusetts that we run, and we're seeing 20% rate increases there. To Chris's point about the 10% over admin assumption and us not knowing what goes in there, and they just lump everything in there. The Massachusetts rate setting assumptions say 12%. So when ODP tells us it can't be more than 10%, CMS won't permit it to be more than 10%. Look at other states. Massachusetts uses 12. Pennsylvania ICF, which ODP also administers, allows your overhead and admin to be as high as 13%. So ODP's own programs allow it to be more than 10%, yet they use 10% because it keeps costs down and it allows them to fit within the appropriation. So it's really on all of us to appeal and advocate so that, we can do our part, to getting people off the waiting list, because it ultimately comes down to funding. All right, any other thoughts from the panelists before we open it up to discussion from the audience?
As we do that, Tom, I'll just jump in with a few things we've seen in the Q&A. We will get the recording out. I'm sure there's interest, as Bill noted in the masterclass session here. Again, thank you, Tom. Thanks all of you, really, for the input and perspective you've given us. So I'll also mention, since overtime, it really, I've been calling it like a fatal flaw in the assumptions, agreeing with what everything you have said, Tom, and others have weighed in on as well. I think the reality also is we see that they're just backing into an appropriation as well. And something I'm not sure I said at the outset that we should emphasize is our understanding is that ODP will publish these rates August 31st, which we have communicated that as of the other associations, but we now understand they will be published as final. There will not be a comment period. They will accept comments, actually, but the rates will not change. They have acknowledged these will be final rates. They will be made retroactive to July 1st. They should be available for billing October 1st. So that is the plan. So they will be a full year at what Tom has reviewed and everybody has already contributed to. Rate appeals become an individual decision. I think as you look at that, take a look at the slide deck when you get it and all the work that's been put into it. Craig, if you can post even the TPA comment letter, it's on our website. But if you take a look, I think we devoted, at least a page to overtime. We had some discussions thanks to people on this panel, our government advocacy committee. We convened a little session and really got some great input specifically on the overtime issue. What do they do in state centers with overtime? Is it zero there, where the wage is actually higher than what they project for community programs? Bill Harriger called that out. We put it into the letter. So there's things there that I think are instrumental in consideration. And kind of crossing over into advocacy, there's still well over $100 million state dollars in the state centers. That actually increased a year after 2 of the state centers closed. That is funding that has already been earmarked for IDA augmentation account. So that's money that's supposed to stay in the system. There's no guarantee that stays in the system. We have to advocate for that. So we argue that if that money stays in the system, that can be a contributing factor toward rates. As you consider rate appeals, you don't have to demonstrate an operating loss. This is in our letter, and Bill referenced this as well. We are arguing that rates are behind market. CPIU has increased, double digits, over 20%. Every time Mercer issues one of these reports, they use some trending data that we really don't understand where it comes from. It's presumably the wage data from the SOC codes that Mercer uses, which are not DSPs. So that's another factor in sort of the flexibility they have in building rates. At the end of the day, they also anchor these 25th percentile and lower bound with things like the Pennsylvania minimum wage, the city of Philadelphia minimum wage. So you can actually argue that that alone eradicates anything that they use in terms of trending or SOC code. So there's a lot to consider. But I think at the end of the day, you have to look at impact on your organization. Are the rates sufficient for you to do business, to invest for sustainability? And I also want to add that I do think we are engaging in a conversation about annual review of rates. Again, we've pressed that for a long time, as you probably know. We have 2 current bills in the legislature. If Craig's able to post those, we've been trying to have a conversation about using CPI-U as a market index. So we ask all of you to keep us accountable at TPA, communicate with the other associations. The associations continue to talk about these efforts. What can we do to offset what was just taken back? And what can we do to make sure that we're not waiting every 3 years for another rate review? So there is discussion about that, but that will take a lot of work. As we've all just learned firsthand, we felt we were very effective in getting an investment into rates, and that did not come to pass because it required passage by the legislature and agreement from all parties involved. So it will take a lot of work and effort and time to get that done. But those are elements that we think are very important. We agree. Lindsay, with what you said, Annual, that's something that if you have a sustainable system and you're pursuing a multi-year growth strategy and you're trying to eliminate the emergency waiting list for adults in Pennsylvania, and workforce is an emphasis in order to do that and to increase service capacity in order to do that, we really can't be waiting every 3 years. So it's a very reasonable, practical argument, and we have to put the details around that. The last thing I'll say is kind of resorting back to the discussion on rate appeals. Part of the association's strategy was, as you probably know, we sent 2 letters to Governor Shapiro asking for 430 million state dollars. That was absolutely predicated on inflation, actual to date, and a modest projection of inflation that turned out to be relatively close. So we asked for the same amount of money, actually in the same year, but we decided we wanted to also ask ODP to do a rate review, do the rate study, so you're not just taking the number in our letter, you'll take your actuarial analysis, and we will fall behind your number. We won't tell you what the number should be. And that's what the Mercer report was. They came back. It was not as much as we asked for, but we uniformly among the provider association community said it is a healthy investment. It is something we can get behind, support the administration. So again, as Tom goes through all this detail, you see that these are their numbers. ODP engaged Mercer, came back with their study. It was the governor himself at the NADSP conference last September who announced that he had just ordered a Medicare rate review for the programs that support DSPs and that support community programs for people with intellectual disabilities and their families. So, that was an initiative of the state. This is the report that backs it up. So I know that's an individual decision, and certainly as you want to follow up on any of these things, I know any of these panelists would talk to you, but to close out with, you will have a tight window to make that decision. More than likely, it will be within 30 days of the publication date of August 31st. I don't anticipate changes. Those are the rules of appeals. So you have 30 days. There is a 30-day window within which appeal is accepted by the Office of Hearings and Appeals. So again, I'm sure we'll have more information out on that as those rates become final, if there are indeed any changes, but just a few reflections that I wanted to add. Thanks again, Tom, and everybody, and we can certainly open it up to any questions from anybody out in the group.
And Lindsay.
In the past, Patrick, you've facilitated appeals, sort of like a group appeal. Will you be doing that again for this as well?
I expect that we will. I mean, I literally always say I'd love for us to be out of this business where the rates would be sufficient, and we're talking about advocacy and the ability to carry it forward. I feel that the overtime issue alone has pretty much left us no choice when you consider the implications of that. When you just consider how wrong it is, or when you were struggling for what's the right adjective, I struggled the same way. What do we put in the letter? I stopped short of saying ludicrous, outrageous, whatever's in there is in there, but that's really how it struck me. How can there be 0% overtime? Again, we have to be mindful that it may make no difference. Some of the feedback is, well, we'll change the assumption, but it won't necessarily result in the fee schedule process in increased rates because they're locking into an appropriation. And that's why I think that the appeal process is probably the next logical step to go. It's too early to say exactly what we would do, but I am sure that in advance of publication, we will talk with the council. We work with the TPA. We have several TPA members currently engaged in appeals with us. And we also, I know, have TPA members engaged in appeals with other attorneys as well. So I expect that it will be a similar effort. Our information is about 80 organizations filed appeal on the 2022 fee schedule rates way back when those were published and made final. So at this point, I would have to believe if we're effective in talking about this issue and it resonates with all of you, the way that it resonates with me and the people on this panel who have already spoken, it is just an unreasonable foundation on which to establish fee schedule rates. And again, their arguments are that the overtime rule from the Fair Labor Standards Act enables them to say that DSPs don't earn overtime. So we see it as a legal interpretation flaw that converts into an enormous material change financially in the rates and what everyone is reimbursed for the services they provide. So I would expect, knowing that, they've never done it this way before. I'll just quote, there was some overtime. Those of you on the rate work group know we questioned that. It was too low. It was embedded into the wage. They've never come out and said it's 0% for residential services.
Go ahead, Oren.
Yeah, so just two things. The word that kept coming to my mind, Patrick, was egregious. I really can't think of a softer word. It's I mean, that's horrible. And I guess this will be my second point. Everyone on this call would probably agree that when you're backing into an appropriation, you don't change known facts to do that, right? So you have an appropriate, you have every one of us does this at work and in our personal lives. You have a certain dollar that you're working within. You don't just arbitrarily say, well, this fact doesn't exist anymore. You would then create some kind of line entry that allows you to reduce, expected expenses in a way to meet that appropriation. Again, I can't even believe that ODP would just act like or assume that DSPs in community homes don't earn overtime and that the providers don't have them. I mean, most of us just did a huge survey, the NCI survey, that specifically asked about overtime.
Yeah, I'll jump in if I can. When these rates reduction first came out, I thought, well, maybe we should ask ODP to just kick the can down the road when it comes to pay for performance and reallocate those funds to the rates. And so at a recent TPA meeting, I was able to talk to a couple of the folks from ODP, and one of them shared that there's about 50 million that they figure is in the pay for performance bucket. So there's not enough money to make up this $121 million shortfall, reallocating those funds. But to beat the dead horse on the overtime, basically what ODP and Mercer is doing is they're saying that all of us providers are in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act for not paying our DSPs, at least our DSPs, at an overtime rate. And it is interesting that the maximum rate that a DSP employed at the state this year will make $26.55. And God bless them, there's about 50 of them. And they get paid overtime because it's the duties question, not the dollar question. The duties will supersede if you are exempt or not. It's an either or. And when that rate goes up, January 1 of 25, it's going to go up to $28.20. So how many middle managers do we have that are doing exempt type work that are being paid less than 28 bucks? We're all going to have to walk through an analysis to see should we raise them to $28, or are we going to make them non-exempt and actually ask them to punch the clock or to keep time records so we can appropriately pay them overtime? Because they're going to come back and say, yeah, they pay me 40 hours, but I really work 50. And the burden is on us to prove them wrong if they don't keep track of that time. So there's a bunch of hoops to go through. I guess there's people are trying to put a block on that increase as of 1/1/25, but we'll have to see where that goes. But it all ties back to overtime. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Mike Smith, I think your hand's up. Are you able to unmute? Greg, if you can help me out, if there's anybody else with a raised hand among the attendees. So just
Nope, Mike's
text us in the
Mike, your
chat.
your mic is on. Mike, your mic is unmuted.
Okay, last call, Mike, or anybody else, and we'll turn it back to you, Tom, to wrap up, or any final thoughts from panelists.
Yeah, and if anyone's having difficulty using the microphone, you could put your question into the chat or the Q&A potentially.
Yes, chat or Q&A, we can certainly provide an update there.
And as anyone's typing, I'll just use a final pitch that I do feel that we are very fortunate in the state of Pennsylvania to have an appeals process. I understand that that is not a requirement for all Medicaid programs. We do operate in other states that do not have a formal appeals process. So although it is relatively expensive to pursue, and the appeals are certainly not timely, at least there is a mechanism that we could use when we find egregious errors in the rate setting. And I do hope that everyone does consider reaching out to their attorney on August 31st to do the appeal. Craig, did we have any additional questions come through?
So Natalie, you raised your hand. You should be able to go ahead and just check in Q&A right now. Just a comment from Q&A, thanking for the comprehensive review.
We're all happy to do it.
Natalie, go ahead.
Natalie's question is, there was a survey sent out recently regarding SC intensity of caseload. Is that going to tie to the rate proposals? Does anyone know that? The answer to that? I don't know the answer, but I will venture a guess that it will not, because what we know is that for 181 services or 118 services, ODP is throwing out all the rate setting assumptions and any data that they thought was relevant to create market-based rates, and are just going to back into a number that is 6 or 8%. So arguably, that data would no longer be relevant, unfortunately. Any other questions?
Paula, you should be able to talk now.
And I see Mike wrote a question in. Do apologize with mic issue. However, being a smaller provider and having many NG4 and NG5, please keep us posted on any ways we can assist with appeals. So I will, we are out of time. I thank everyone. I will add just in response to the comment, Mike, appeals, despite what the conversation we had earlier and what you may hear or understand if you haven't been involved in the process before, every individual provider must file a separate appeal. There isn't not a joint appeal process. Generally speaking, they get consolidated and we're able to share legal expenses and create some efficiencies. And in fact, in this cycle, we've been able to talk with all of the known attorneys really that have rate appeals. So it's been a really great group process. But to be clear, when the information comes out, individually, you have 30 days to file appeal. We can certainly connect you with our counsel at K&L Gates. They are in our membership, so they're very experienced with this. In the past, we have set up sessions for people who are interested to get the details. It's not a lengthy process, but for them to do that and represent you, they have to go through a conflicts check and then initially file. And then generally thereafter, there is a motion to consolidate those appeals so that they're basically treated as one appeal. But that's probably an important information for some of you that maybe have not gone through the process before. But with that, Tom, I'll give you a final word. Thank you once again and all the panelists. And I really appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you.
Yeah, so again, when the rates come out on August 31st, I can't say it enough. Please talk to your attorneys and consider strongly appealing. Thank you so much for being attentive and have a great weekend, everyone.